subscribe and like the video.
You have to follow that up by saying all of the water resources readily available in Southern California actually had above average water. So clearly, if additional water coming in from other states was not going to yield a tangible positive benefit in this situation, that one reservoir was not going to change the outcome either, and that the problem wasn't actually inadequate water supply, but the fact that we don't have pumps. Like the fact that, one, it is virtually impossible to use water hydrants to combat a fire that was spreading at 100 miles. That's number one. And this is, I'm not a fire marshal, okay? I'm not like a professional at this. I'm simply listening to what fire experts have said, like people who are tasked with investigating what's going on here and people who have experience combating both wildfires and structural fires in general. These two things are different than one another. Wildfires are different than structural fire. That's number one. And number two, as far as the structural fires goes, when you combine 100-mile winds and wildfires with a dense area, like a dense urban landscape, it is impossible for a normal fire department, like a municipal fire department, to combat fires of that severity. Impossible, because water hydrants are there to, put down a structural fire in an entire city block. Water hydrants are not capable of combating fires in every city block. Like if the wildfires, especially with 100-mile winds or 80-mile winds, are spreading the fire to virtually every structure, it is impossible to save an entire city with simply water hydrants alone. Okay, I work in fire sprinkler systems. The systems and buildings are only designed to have one building on fire at a time, and a few fire trucks taking water from the hydrants, not thousands of fires at once. Exactly. Like, think about it this way. It's like a fire tornado. Okay? If you can't stop a normal tornado, then you definitely can't stop a fire tornado. Do you understand? Like, this doesn't mean that there can't be better protections and infrastructure hardening ahead of time. Okay? Mitigation is and prevention is one of the most important aspects of fire safety. These guys, on the other hand, are using this water reservoir conversation to look at the California water wars and greatly extend it, make the California water wars worse in general. There is already an issue with allocation. There's already an issue with irrigation in the state. Trump wants to make it worse. And he is not above using this natural disaster to make that political point. Having said that, initially, in the interim period, were there other structures that could have been preserved and saved? Most likely. Was there a water allocation problem? Yes. This wasn't because of the reservoirs, though. This was simply because there wasn't electric generators or the electric pumps necessarily that actually move water from reservoirs into the hydrant were decommissioned because they shut down the energy in these regions. And there was no fail-safe that, there were no electric generators that continued pumping water, as far as I understand, right? Normally, the electric pumps that move water around within the system are powered by the same electric grid that powers everything else. But when you shut down the electric grid because you don't want to start new electric start new fires born out of short circuiting alongside the existing electricity grid, because of those winds, you end up you end up shutting off the pumps, and water cannot move around as easily as it's supposed to, and you arrive at this problem. Okay, but time will tell. There will be investigations that are conducted, and time will tell. Donald Trump, on the other hand, has no interest in figuring out what the truth is, because if you're not interested in solving a problem and instead are simply interested in using an existing problem to do propaganda, then you don't need to figure out the truth at all. You could just immediately go, these fires happen because there wasn't enough water in California. and that the best way to solve it is to ensure that we dam the San Joaquin Valley Reservoir and the waterways up there, and send more water down to Southern California so that the agribusiness can thrive. It's just an extensive project that a lot of the agricultural producers in Southern California have wanted for quite some time, and Trump is using this as an opportunity to advocate for that. It seems like this would be, at least according to experts once again, it seems like this would lead to ecological disaster, further ecological disaster in the San Joaquin Valley. So it's ironically accelerating the main accelerant that is responsible for having so much dry brush, for example, so much fuel readily available in Southern California. As I've talked about before, especially as it pertains to Southern California wildfire, a period of historic flooding, okay, like historic wet season flooding, followed by a period of historic drought in the next subsequent wet season, creates first a massive amount of brush, and then completely sucks the moisture out of that brush, creating what is known as fuel. Okay, so it's devastating, and then you pair that up with you pair that up with atmospheric pressure and faster winds as a consequence of that, and all of a sudden you have created this perfect chaotic situation where these unimaginable, once in a lifetime natural disasters become incredibly commonplace. There's two things that you can do in this process. Why not use water from the ocean? They do. It's a last resort in this situation, but they of course use that. Okay. There's two things you have to do. Right? Yes, these are optimal conditions for maximum devastation. One, when you have a complex problem like this, the solution is always multifaceted. Ironically enough, by the way, if you want to ask about the ocean water, it's salt water. Okay? So salt water actually has devastating long-term consequences as well. When you pump salt water, like those super cool planes that come in and pick up the ocean water and then dump it on top of the wildfires, when you actually do that consistently, you're literally killing the vegetation and creating even more dry vegetation down the line for future wildfires. So it's actually literally a last-ditch effort. Salting the land is devastating for the vegetation, hence salt the earth. So you're changing the soil. You're also drying out the future vegetation that creates even more brush, more dry brush, which is known as fuel for even more devastating wildfires down the line. So it is done, okay? But of course, it's used as a last resort. And we certainly used it quite extensively this time around in combating these massive wildfires. Okay? Now, in terms of methods of combating this, like I said, this is a very complex problem. So the solutions are also multifaceted. On the one hand, you have to try. Are you just reading? No, I'm just explaining this to you from the top of my dome because I've explained it a million times over. So I'm just repeating the same things that I've said, possibly at least 1,000 times in the last month or so. Okay? So, as I was saying, on the one hand, you have to scale back our carbon footprint to the best of our ability and create structures that are harder to burn down. But even if it's not the structures itself that are harder to burn down, you have to also do constant maintenance of the vegetation around structures where people live. Okay? This requires funds. So on the one hand, you have to engage in systemic change to try and mitigate climate change, right? To scale back to the best of our ability so that we don't, we don't all die in the climate apocalypse. On the other hand, you also have to ensure that our infrastructure is up to code. change the regulations surrounding the way we build buildings in wildfire-prone areas, and also change the way we change the vegetation around it. You know what I mean? Change the maintenance of the vegetation around it. Make sure that there's like proper upkeep. Make sure that the government is also consistently making sure that people are following this code. All of this stuff is pesky regulation and code that a lot of homeowners despise. Donald Trump also despises it. Okay? Enforcing native plant standards to ensure that we don't have eucalyptus trees, for example, that are literally filled to the brim with explosive material is like one of the things that you could do. You know, making sure that we have underground power lines, no matter the cost, is another thing that we must do in terms of hardening the infrastructure, right? If Los Angeles is prone for the power grid consistently failing, you either have to do rolling blackouts during wind season and wildfire season to ensure that these downed power lines don't end up, causing short circuits and electrical failures that are right on top of dry vegetation that is overgrown, right? And create wildfires like the Paradise one, the campfire one from a couple years back. Or you have to, with the existing infrastructure that we have, make sure that all of the power lines are clearly maintained and far away from any kind of vegetation whatsoever. Okay. And last but not least, and like I said, the rebuilding efforts. We should be doing the exact opposite of what the California government has said that they're going to do, which is build the buildings in the exact same way as fast as possible. But that's too complicated. And it's too costly for businesses that want to turn profit year over year. They would rather gamble with our lives and not do the necessary updates, knowing full well that the politicians are bought and sold anyway, and therefore will never hold them to account and will never actually demand that they take the initiative at the behest of public safety. And politicians like Donald Trump will look at the situation and use it to their advantage to propagandize one of their pet projects at the behest of certain key sectors that have been able to communicate to him the necessity for more climate disaster inducing decisions in terms of irrigation. From what I understand, historically, California wasn't necessarily a desert land in the way that we see it. It was, a century of water mismanagement that made it certainly a lot less lush. So Donald Trump using this as an opportunity is expected. Using this as an opportunity to further his agenda is expected, and yet still devastating.
The president also suggested
one key element you're missing, no hate, is the suburban sprawl and lack of density causing huge encroachment on nature. I mean, sure, that's a part of it. And also building in areas that are like super susceptible to the most devastating impacts of climate change, like Malibu. Everyone knows that when you build in Malibu, you're building on borrowed time. Okay? The investment that you've made is against time. The investment that you've made is against time. Either your house is going to fall victim to landslides caused by erosion, or it's going to directly be underwater at a certain point, right? Except instead of those two things happening, they were burned to the ground. Then why make those investments? Because we are hyper-focused on short-term profit seeking. That's it. Short-term always. We have no capacity to think in decades. We have no capacity to think in centuries. We only think in quarterly profits. That's it. That is capitalism. Okay? So ultimately, no matter how much I yell about these issues, changes seem impossible. Okay? And our government is not designed to put long-term stability and the people's interests above short-term profit seeking. Are these all the Republicans' fault or Dems as well? Oh, absolutely. The Democrats play a role in this. This is California, baby. This is a Democratic safe haven. This is a Democratic stronghold. This also is part of the problem with the next century of global politics. Western capitalist nations have completely lost the capacity to take initiative against capital. Western capitalist nations are servile to corporate interests. Everybody kind of understands this. Some people have a nihilistic perspective on it, and they think, that's just the system. Now I'm just going to get my money up. I'm going to be a servant myself. And hopefully one day, if I'm lucky enough, I can dominate and be a billionaire too, right? And I don't think people understand. Corporate interests and constant profit seeking is antagonistic to good governance. Okay? That's it. Because when I say good governance, responsible governance, a government that is tasked with uplifting the welfare of its citizens, okay, I mean like sometimes taking the initiative and not engaging in short-term profit seeking, and maybe even sometimes doing things that corporations are going to absolutely despise. Gun violence is a great example of this because it is not a natural disaster, and yet it is treated as such in the United States of America. Gun violence is a problem born out of gun manufacturers and their interest in profit. Okay? It is a viable and robust industry in this country, gun manufacturing. And because of that, we have this attitude where gun violence is just another aspect of natural American life, as though it is a natural disaster. It is not a natural disaster at all. And people just simply lie to maintain this position, right? Gun violence is not like 100-mile winds. Gun violence is not like a typhoon. It's not like a massive, devastating earthquake. It's not like tornado season, right? Those things, no matter how hard we try, are still going to be impossible at a certain point to combat. You know, shit happens. Gun violence, on the other hand, is not that at all. That's precisely the reason why it's virtually non-existent in other countries, whereas it is a part of daily existence in the United States of America. Think about gun violence. I'm in Japan right now. This is not an issue here. Why? It's because the Japanese industry does not have a robust gun manufacturing business that has been able to completely capture the entirety of its government and will work to change our cultural attitudes surrounding gun violence or surrounding guns in general. And therefore, it's not a problem here. That's it. With some exceptions. Shinzo Abe comes to mind. Anyway, let's get back to Donald Trump. Now that I've spent the last 30 minutes trying to pour over everything that he said and try to explain to people why it's stupid and what the actual complicated solutions are.
Withholding federal aid for recovery.
I don't think we should give California anything until they let water flow down.
It's rare to put conditions on disaster relief, but he also called for California to adopt a voter ID law that would check for citizenship before granting aid. But while meeting with local leaders on Friday, the president said he wants to see Los Angeles start rebuilding as soon as possible.
We're going to essentially waive all federal permits. We're going to have you go very quickly.
On Friday, California legislators approved $2.5 billion in state funds to help with cleanup and rebuilding. As Governor Newsom greeted the president, politics were set aside.
I appreciate the governor coming out and meeting me, Kevin.
And politics aside, fire crews are still fighting fires. They will get some help over the weekend. The area expecting its first significant rainfall in more than 8 months, but with it comes the threat of mudslides. For CBS Saturday Morning, Jonathan Vigliotti.
All right. We are going to talk about the Gaza ceasefire and the 4 Israeli hostages freed by Hamas in swap for 200 Palestinian prisoners. Now, these aren't 4 Israeli hostages. These are 4 Israeli prisoners of war. These are 4 Israeli soldiers. Okay? Make no mistake, Channel 4, albeit is one of the best Western outlets out there in terms of communicating exactly what's going on in Gaza to the best of their ability. Okay? And yet there's still a bar there. While they clear that low bar, it's still far from the appropriate way of talking about these issues. So it's something you should understand. And the reason why it is especially important to recognize in this situation is because in order to combat that narrative, Hamas this time around made them wear their IDF garb in their release. Okay? Now, Remember, for the past 16 months, Israel has propagandized about both the understandable, the devastation of October 7 and the subsequent propaganda that consistently claimed, without any evidence whatsoever, mind you, that these Palestinians are all barbaric monsters and that they had no political motivations and no interest in emancipation whatsoever in any of their actions, but simply are operating on anti-Semitic tendencies and did this because they despise Jewish people and want to rape them, right? They kidnapped people not because they wanted a political bargaining chip, a leverage over the sovereign occupying nation that has dominated their existence with no means of emancipation whatsoever, no way out of this horrifying process whatsoever in a concentration camp that is also known as Gaza, the world's largest open-air prison, but instead for selfish, violent desire. So this initiative, the way that this release happened from Hamas's designs here was to combat that misinformation, to showcase that, one, to the best of their limited abilities under a ruthless and brutal blockade and consistent bombing, that international organs of justice and humanitarian groups, including Israeli humanitarian groups, have called a militants tasked with Palestinian emancipation and the resistance against the Israeli apartheid and Israeli were able to successfully secure the well-being to the best of their abilities of the prisoners that they had taken. This completely undermines the Israeli narrative. If you recall, there was a lot of back and forth in Israeli media talking about how these girls are being raped every day. They're pregnant. They fear for the worst. There was no evidence for this whatsoever. Okay? Not to say that this would never happen, right? I'm not saying that at all. As I've maintained throughout my coverage of October 7, and as I've talked about consistently, even in other instances, right? Violence and assault is all too common in the field of battle, okay? It happens all the time. So there is a likelihood that it could have happened here as well. And yet, there was no evidence to suggest that it had happened to these hostages. But at the time, the colonizers' imagination was the only evidence necessary. I-24 said Israel prepares for female hostages in Gaza to return pregnant. Report, Israel permits abortion up to the moment of birth. Medical professionals stress the mental toll of conceiving through rape in captivity. More than 9 months, Hostage Family Forum publishes videos implying pregnant hostages. The video depicts a tunnel, which cuts to a video of a pregnant woman and the sound of a baby crying. And yet when they were released, unlike the horrifying conditions of the Palestinians that were falsely detained by the Israeli apartheid regime, in spite of the fact that they literally were also side by side with Palestinians experiencing the ruthless Israeli bombing campaigns, they came across far healthier than the Palestinian prisoners that are released on a daily basis.
If all goes well, the end of this nightmare is in sight. Hamas fighters walking the 4 young Israeli soldiers they've held for 477 days since the awful events of October 7th to a podium in Gaza City. Karina Ariev, Daniela Gilboa, Liri Olbag and Nama Levy wave at the cameras they know are beaming footage back home to their friends and
New conspiracy, they gave birth and the babies are hostage now? I have a horrible theory. What if they were impregnated, gave birth, and now released without their babies? And now Hamas is blackmailing and using those babies to keep them from telling the world what happened. It's not out of the realm of possibility for the sick animals. 420 likes. I would treat those babies like the devil's spawn. But 1, they're Jewish. 2, aren't babies innocent and have no say in how they're born into this world? They're not Jewish. They're the seed of devil subhumans. So it's interesting to see in real time how a population that has been completely captive to fascist propaganda that spawned over almost an entire century, right, reacts to situations like this. One day, if the world has not completely fallen to authoritarian fascism, historians will look back at these moments and document, and will greatly, I guess, elevate the field of fascist scholarship surrounding and historical research surrounding how a captive population receives fascist doctrine and how it changes their collective psyche. This is the fantasies of an insane person, okay? And it's happening in real time, and it's very consequential. Like, this is the very fact that people don't immediately go, this is the most insane thing I've ever heard in my entire life. You are out of your mind. And instead, people go, you know what? You're probably saying a very scary truth right now, is damning for anyone with any critical thinking skills. Okay? It's devastating. But that is the reason why they did this release, this show of force, this show to basically say, look, the conditions that you claim that these hostages were in is not the conditions that they were actually in. And all matter of death and devastation that they experienced came in the hands of Israeli bombing campaigns. Now, this has been a consistent thing that we have heard from Israeli hostages that have been released. From the first hostage release that took place on humanitarian grounds, I think her name was Lipschitz, the old lady, all the way to even the likes of Noah Argani, who was a very famous Israeli captive that was taken from the Nova Festival, if you recall. Most Israeli hostages and prisoners of war have repeatedly said the exact same things, that the real fear that they experienced was the bombs falling on them indiscriminately. And even Israeli news has reported this, in spite of the obvious restrictions placed upon Israeli media from its fascist government. I fear, and I say this with sincerity, I fear this has happened throughout history under very similar circumstances, as a matter of fact. If you recall, the entire concept of the Manchurian Candidate, going all the way back to the Korean War for a brief moment, is born out of a very similar perspective. The American government, the American State Department, alongside American interests in the region, consistently dehumanized both the Koreans and the Chinese, right? And because of that, when Koreans were held, when American soldiers were held captive by the Koreans or the Chinese, they were not mistreated, yet the media kept saying that they were. So when they actually